Hi, my name is Blin, and for my AR project, I'm doing translanguaging. Okay, so for my context, the student I'm using for my school is Sunny Lake Elementary School. You can see some pictures of my classroom up on the right. And then for the data that you see, you'll notice that the green and yellow bars are equal to each other. And that's because my school is a single school district. So that's why school and district data are the same. Kind of moving on to that, if you really look at the data, you'll notice that a high population or a high percentage of the population is made up of Hispanics, and then second to that is Black students. So that kind of feeds into um, our emergent bilingual kind of makeup. So since we have such a high population of Hispanics, you'll notice that there are a corresponding high level of in emergent bilingual students that are predominantly Hispanic. Okay. My specific research focuses on 3 emergent bilingual students. We do guided reading sessions together, we do these stations together, and they all have a high level of proficiency in English. And the names I'll be using for them is Agustin, Jorge, and Samuel. Okay, so moving on to my questions, my student-focused research question is what translanguaging patterns and practices do my students use? So this one's kind of nice and open. It allows me to get a lot of data about just kind of general things that I notice in terms of patterns and practices with translanguaging. And then moving on is the teacher-focused research question. So that's asking how can I, as a teacher researcher, utilize data on translanguaging patterns to create linguistically responsive teaching practices. So that's kind of building off of that first question, kind of does something with the data, is kind of showing what pragmatic things can we do now that we have this data, what can we use this to, kind of going forward, what can we do with it? Okay, so if we look at the conceptual framework, a lot of the research that I've done focuses on either trying to define translanguaging, and it also might include other terms that are related to translanguaging. So when we define translanguaging, it talks about this kind of system of languages, which is really important. So that makes it different from code switching, whereas code switching kind of just talks about, you know, you're switching between using this language and this language, and you're kind of switching between them. Translanguaging really embraces that idea that it's an integrated system. So, you know, you're constantly borrowing things from both language that it isn't even just language itself, but can also be kind of conventions from the language or other ideas from the language. So that kind of integrated system of translanguaging, and then if you kind of move that to another level, code meshing, I heard in one of my articles, which is essentially the same thing as translanguaging, except it adds another layer to it. Instead of just considering languages, it also considers kind of communication modes and diverse symbol systems. So now we're not only just considering regular languages, but also other means of communication. So that is code mesh. Okay, moving on to data collection. Throughout the 10 days, I had these different ways that I was collecting data. So primarily, I would give it to the recordings, which were all audio recordings. So I took these every single day with my students when we were in our guided reading centers. And then kind of moving on, I had field notes. So those were prepared really nicely. It let me kind of highlight what were the important things that were going on in those recordings. And then the surveys that I had on day 1 and day 10. Okay, so moving on to my analysis tools. Kind of touched on it already. So audio recordings, field notes, surveys, artifacts, and then my code. So I have English, Spanish, mixed language. These are all kind of the simpler ones. You can usually just replace the symbol with the word that it represents. Moving on to the pronunciation and convention. So I would use pronunciation whenever I have to describe how a student pronounced something. And so I use this these brackets to put that pronunciation in the international phonetic alphabets. You can see exactly how they pronounce that. And then for convention, this is usually paired with the ES or M. So you can see if the conventions that were in English, the conventions that were in Spanish, or the conventions that are kind of in both languages. And so in those brackets, I'll kind of be putting what was the convention that was followed. So it might be like SC, and then the convention that was followed was, so SC would be Spanish convention, and the convention that was followed would be the pronunciation of the letter D, for example. Okay, moving on to my first finding. So I noticed that students use knowledge from English when they are unsure about Spanish conventions. So a good example happened right off the bat when we started reading for the first time, and we had to read kind of like this first sentence. And so what you'll notice here is the way that my student read calendar years is normal if you would read it kind of using the English conventions, but for Spanish conventions, it was irregular. And so we're going to kind of look into that. Okay. So go ahead and start on top of page 4. Right, so you can see that he said 19, 11. So what he essentially did, when we talk about calendar dates in English, we break them up into two sets of 2-digit numbers. So we say something for like 1911, 1911. So you do the same thing in Spanish, 19, 11. However, that's not what the Spanish convention is. So we could see kind of that notated in there that he called the English convention for breaking apart calendar years into two sets of 2-digit numbers. Okay, second example for the first finding comes from more pronunciation. So this was seen with Samuel when he pronounced the verb. He says it's a name, but it's a verb, and we'll see how he pronounces that. So he says Constantine Flair. This is more of like an English pronunciation. So I'm assuming that he kind of either English took over or that's just something that he borrowed that pronunciation from English. So you can see again that when they're kind of unsure or maybe they're not ready to use those Spanish conventions, then English is taking over. And then for my second finding, I noticed that students naturally follow some distinct Spanish conventions. So when I'm talking about conventions, I'm talking about rules and just general things that usually happen within the language. So one of those rules is that whenever you come across a letter or a word that has the letter Z in it, it's always pronounced with an S sound, unlike English where it's pronounced with a Z sound. Z. It shares that sound with S. And so you can see that again in this example. Right, so Samuel says empezó with the Z. Augustine corrects him by saying empezó, and then Samuel repeats that correction, empezó. So you can see that Augustine over here clearly naturally had like this understanding that the Z sound made an S noise, or that in this word you make the S noise. And for our third finding, notice that cognates help bridge languages. Okay, so for our example, we have Jorge connecting the cognate fundo, the cognates fundo and fund. So cognates are a set of words or pair of words that are similar between languages. And so we can see that with this example. So what does it mean? Yeah, so it's fun. So it's like a fun for comedians, a comedian, right? Yeah. So I don't know if you can hear in this example, but Jorge in the background was excited that he got this kind of a connection because he kind of just guessed. He was like, oh, fundo doesn't mean fund, and he got it right. And so he was enthusiastic about that. But it shows how cognates can be useful. Okay, then moving on to the conclusion. So just going to review the findings. English can be a support for another language. And that kind of goes the other way around. We'll be talking about that. And then there are, when students go to read in a language that they have either practice speaking in, but not practice reading in or writing in, you can see that there are still underlying understandings of those conventions in those languages. And then the cognates can be a support for students who know more than one language. It's pretty straightforward. And going to our other takeaways that I've noticed is that student interest seemed to be really high when I was doing these activities. There are specific times where, for example, when I would say that we were going to do another activity in Spanish, students were excited. And then in consideration with cognates, one of my students would use cognates constantly, but then about half of the time get them wrong or get the translation wrong because he wasn't really considering the other words around it or the context. So while cognates can be helpful, they can also be kind of misleading. So it's important that you teach students how to use those if that's something that they're going to use. And then the application for low level, I say Spanish speakers, but I mean Spanish speakers who are learning English, right? So like low level English speakers, really what I meant to say there. And the application is that, we said that English can be used as a support for Spanish. Same goes the other way around. So if you're learning English, and Spanish can be that support. So when you're in those lower levels of English proficiency, that's when a home language can be helpful. And then some kind of applications, some takeaways, and some kind of ways that we can use this in the future. Focusing on like the positive and additive perspectives. It's really important for students because it can allow them to see their language as something that's beneficial. And when they value it, it's something that they can kind of practice on their own, or are more likely to practice on their own and are more likely to do something with it. And so activities like this can be helpful for that. Then the second point, supporting home language development. This activity directly got to do that by having students read in their home language. And then you might be wondering, like, what can monolingual teachers do then? Monolingual teachers, you don't have to speak the language of your student. Well, even bilingual teachers, if you don't speak the language of your student, you can have them do an activity in that language to have them read in that language. If they know how to do that, or have them write in that language as a kind of starting point that can be really helpful. And then kind of the last bigger picture thing that I took away from this was that you can use one language to support another, right? So that goes for whatever language you already know, whatever language you want to know. That language that you already know is always going to be a support when you're trying to learn another language. Okay, that was my presentation. Thank you.